August 1943. The Solomon Islands campaign was at its violent peak, and American Corsair pilots were dying with a question no one could answer. Their F4U Corsairs were meant to be the fastest fighters in the Pacific. 417 men on paper, a full 50 meters faster than the Japanese A6M-0. Yet somehow, in the chaotic dogfights above Munda and New Georgia, the Zeros were pulling away at the most critical moments. Pilots lined up perfect deflection shots, pressed the trigger, and watched their targets simply race out of range. It wasn't bad flying. It wasn't fear. It was physics turning against them when they needed it most. The contradiction was maddening. Back at the Vought factory in Stratford, Connecticut, the Corsair had broken every speed record thrown at it. Test pilots praised its power. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had approved specs that made it look unbeatable. The 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine produced more thrust than anything Japan had in the sky. The iconic inverted gull-wing design reduced drag. Every part of the Corsair was built for air superiority. Yet, in real combat, where Japanese pilots fought for their homeland and Americans fought 6,000 miles from theirs, the numbers didn't translate into victories. Major Robert Owens of VMF 215 described the problem in a brutally honest report on August 7, 1943. His squadron had faced 12 Zeros over Rendova Harbor at 14,000 feet. The fight began well. Corsairs diving from higher altitude, full of energy, youth, and confidence in their machines. But when the Zeros leveled out and accelerated, Owens's men couldn't keep up. "We should have caught them," he wrote. "The manual says we're faster, but not where it counts." 3 Corsairs came back damaged. 1 never returned. The Zeros escaped untouched. This wasn't rare. Squadron after squadron saw the same thing. At 20,000 feet, the Corsair was a rocket, just as promised. But Pacific air battles rarely happened that high. The Japanese had learned during Guadalcanal to fight lower, between 10,000 and 15,000 feet, where the air was thicker. Their planes turned sharper, and strangely, they could match or beat the Corsair's speed in level flight. American intelligence officers studied captured Zeros, hunting for hidden modifications or secret engine boosts. They found nothing. The Zero was exactly what they thought. A light, agile fighter with a 1,130 horsepower engine that should have been outclassed. Yet the Corsair's speed edge was gone, and it was costing lives. Between June and August 1943, Marine Corsair units in the Solomons scored barely a 1.3 to 1 kill ratio, acceptable, but nowhere near the dominance the Navy had promised when it ordered 4,000 of them. Pilots began doubting their aircraft. In air combat, doubt kills. Some even asked to go back to the older F4F Wildcats, slower, but at least reliable. The situation neared crisis until a 31-year-old crew chief from Terre Haute, Indiana, decided he'd seen enough pilots die over a problem he believed he could solve with a wrench and some simple physics. The Corsair's flaw wasn't in the engine, airframe, or fuel system. It was spinning 127 times per second, 13 feet ahead of the pilot's nose, the 3-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller. Each of its 13-foot 4-inch blades was set at a pitch designed for the thin air at 25,000 feet. In 1941, Navy planners assumed future dogfights would happen that high, based on Europe's bomber wars. The propeller's blade angle had been calculated for those pressures, perfect for thin air where it could extract maximum thrust from the engine's power curve. It was brilliant engineering for a war that wasn't actually happening. Propeller pitch works like a screw in wood. A steep pitch moves you forward fast, but is harder to turn. A shallow pitch spins easily, but gives little push. The Corsair's blades left the factory set at 47.5 at their midpoint, ideal above 20,000 feet. But down at 15,000, where the real fights were, the air was about 30% denser. The propeller was trying to grab too much air for the engine to handle. It was like starting a car in fourth gear. The engine had power, but the propeller couldn't turn it into thrust because the blade angle fought against the air instead of working with it. Vaught's engineers hadn't made a mistake. They'd made an assumption. In 1941, they thought Corsairs would spend most of their time escorting bombers at high altitude. No one at the design tables in Stratford had imagined that the Pacific War would unfold over jungles and harbors, where air battles began at medium altitudes and often dropped into brutal dogfights at 8,000 feet. The propeller pitch that made the Corsair a monster at 25,000 feet turned it into a struggling racehorse at 15,000. Pilots were pushing their throttles to the limit and barely hitting 370 meters in level flight when the manuals said 410. The technical orders sent with every Corsair to the Pacific were clear and strict. Propeller pitch angles were not to be adjusted in the field. Those settings had been perfected after hundreds of hours of wind tunnel testing, high-altitude trials, and engineering calculations thick enough to fill binders 6 inches wide. The propellers were built to microscopic precision, tolerances within hundredths of an inch. Changing the blade pitch required factory clearance, specialized tools, calibrated instruments, and certified engineers. Any unauthorized modification to flight-critical parts meant court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, and, if a crash followed, possible manslaughter charges. Every crew chief in the Pacific knew these rules by heart. The aircraft belonged to the U.S. Navy. The propellers belonged to the U.S. Navy. No one in the field had permission to improve them. But technical orders don't die in combat. Pilots do. By mid-August 1943, Staff Sergeant Jim Lefferts had already stood through 7 memorial services for pilots whose Corsairs had the correct propeller pitch by Connecticut's factory standards, but the wrong one for the skies over the Solomons. He was done watching men die because of regulations that didn't fit the war they were fighting. For 3 weeks, he'd redone the Navy's math. But for the right altitude this time. He had his new numbers, a maintenance tent that locked from the inside, and a plan that might either save lives or end his career. Lefferts was never meant to change naval aviation doctrine. He was a farm boy from Indiana who joined the Marines in 1939 after the Depression wiped out his family's grain business, drawn by the promise of steady meals. He'd washed out of flight school for poor depth perception, but discovered he had a natural feel for machines. By 1943, he'd logged over 4,000 hours working on radial engines and had earned a reputation for keeping Corsairs flying when spare parts were weeks away. He was exactly the kind of non-commissioned officer the Marine Corps was built on: skilled, practical, and brave enough to act when officers hesitated. His breakthrough started with a simple observation. Lefferts noticed that when Corsairs came back from missions at 15,000 feet, their R-2800 engines were running cooler than expected at full throttle. The engines weren't working hard enough. Power was being lost between the crankshaft and the propeller. He began comparing manifold pressure readings to pilot airspeed reports, and a clear pattern emerged. At 14,000 feet, with full throttle, pilots were only reaching 365 to 375 meters per hour. The engines were producing 1,950 horsepower, enough for more than 400 meters. Somewhere, about 200 horsepower was disappearing into thin air. Lefferts had access to the propeller's specifications, nothing secret, just technical. Hamilton Standard's engineering blueprints showed the pitch angles and performance charts for different altitudes. Borrowing a slide rule from the squadron intelligence officer, he recalculated the figures for 15,000 feet instead of 25,000. The denser air meant the blades needed a shallower pitch, about 45 breakers, right, instead of 47.5 at the effective radius. Just a 2.5 degree change, almost invisible to the eye, but aerodynamically it meant the propeller would finally grip the thick air efficiently instead of stalling against it. The numbers suggested this tweak could recover 35 to 45 mph in level flight at combat altitude. The same math also told him he was about to break the law. On August 11th, Lefferts went to Major Stan Bailey, VMF 124's maintenance officer, with his calculations and proposal. Bailey, an MIT engineering dropout turned Marine, understood exactly what Lefferts was risking. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. He asked 3 questions. Are you sure about your math? Can you do it without damaging the propeller? And if it works, can you teach others? Lefferts answered yes to all 3. Bailey's response became legend. I'm not ordering you to do this. I'm not authorizing you to do this. I'll be in my tent with the flap closed. I won't inspect aircraft 17 for 72 hours. Whatever condition I find it in after that, I'll assume the factory delivered it that way. Lefferts chose aircraft 17 on purpose. It belonged to First Lieutenant Bob McClure, a pilot who'd survived 3 missions where Zeros had simply out-accelerated him. McClure had filed multiple reports complaining about his Corsair's poor performance, which meant that if something went terribly wrong during the flight, there was at least paperwork suggesting the aircraft already had issues. It was a thin cover, but it was something. Lefferts gathered his 2 most trusted mechanics, Corporal Eddie Brinks and Private First Class Tommy Huang, swore them to secrecy, and waited until 11 p.m. on August 12, 1943. The maintenance area was quiet, except for guards who'd been persuaded to patrol far from the hangars. The first step was removing the propeller. That meant lifting the Corsair's tail until the nose angled down about 15 degrees, then using a massive hub wrench to loosen the castellated nut that held 130 pounds of spinning metal to the engine shaft. It took all 3 men and a 6-foot breaker bar to crack the torque. They carefully lowered the propeller onto a canvas tarp spread across the coral gravel. For a full minute, Lefferts just stood there staring at it. A piece of equipment worth more than 3 years of his pay. Each blade was a masterpiece, forged aluminum alloy, hollow core, balanced within 2 grams, and he was about to heat it with a blowtorch and twist it with a pipe wrench. The idea was simple in theory, terrifying in practice. Each blade was clamped into the hub at its root. If Lefferts heated the blade's thick base, the shank, to around 400 Grad, the aluminum would soften just enough to bend slightly without cracking. Using a measured lever arm, he could then twist the entire blade to reduce its pitch by 5 degrees. Once cooled, the blade would hold its new shape, optimized for denser air. That was the theory. In practice, he was about to heat aerospace-grade metal in a combat zone where Japanese bombers sometimes attacked at night, and reshape a precision-balanced propeller using tools meant for trucks. Brinks handled the torch, an acetylene welder from the repair shop. The flame had to be wide and even, warming a 6-inch section of the shank without hot spots that could weaken it. Huang had built a makeshift measuring jig from scrap metal, a protractor-like device clamped to the hub to track the blade's angle in real time. Lefferts had done the math. At a 40-inch radius from the center, a 2.5-degree pitch change meant the trailing edge needed to move 1.75 inches relative to the leading edge. It didn't sound like much until you were bending 7 feet of aircraft metal by hand, measuring in fractions of an inch. They started on the first blade at 11:30 p.m. Brinks swept the flame slowly across the shank, while Lefferts watched the metal's color in the moonlight. It had to reach a dull orange glow, hot enough to bend, not so hot that it began to recrystallize. When the color was perfect, Lefferts clamped a 30-inch pipe wrench to the blade tip and applied steady pressure. The metal resisted, then gave with a sharp sound, like a cable snapping tight. Huang called out readings: 1.2, 1.5, 1.75. Stop! Lefferts held the position for 10 seconds while Brinks removed the torch, then released the wrench. The blade held its new angle. They'd just modified a combat aircraft propeller using the same technique backyard mechanics used to straighten truck frames. Blade 2 went quicker. They knew what they were doing now. Blade 3 was trickier. The metal showed faint discoloration, likely from a past hard landing or propeller strike. Lefferts took it slow, heating gradually and twisting carefully, while Huang watched the gauge like a man defusing a bomb. By 3:40 a.m. on August 13th, all three blades were repitched to 45 degrees. What engineers would later call a field optimization modification, Navy prosecutors would later describe as willful destruction of government property. At dawn, they reattached the propeller, torqued it to spec, safety wired it, and left it looking factory perfect. The difference was invisible, aerodynamic, not visual, and, if Lefferts's math was right, worth 40 extra miles per hour. Aircraft 17 sat on the tarmac at Munda Airfield the morning of August 13, 1943, looking like every other Corsair. The engine had been tested twice, once by Lefferts at 6 a.m., once by the assistant crew chief at 7:30. Both runs were flawless. The R-2800 purred smoothly through its full power range, no vibration, no imbalance, no strange resonance. But running fine on the ground and performing at 15,000 feet were two very different things. Lefferts knew the next 2 hours would decide everything. Either he had just improved every Corsair in the Pacific, or he had built a death trap that would tear itself apart in midair. Major Greg "Pappy" Boyington drew the flight, though he had no idea it was a test. On paper, it was a routine combat patrol over New Georgia, a simple 90-minute flight to log hours. Boyington was already a legend, a former Flying Tigers ace with 6 kills before Pearl Harbor, now commanding VMF 214 with a fiery style that made young pilots either idolize him or fear him, either worship him or fear him. Boyington was also the perfect man to test Lefferts's secret modification because he knew the Corsair inside and out. He had logged more than 340 hours in the aircraft, flown it to its structural limits, and had a sixth sense for when something was wrong, or when something was extraordinary. If anyone could feel a 40-mile-per-hour speed boost, it was Boyington. And if anyone could sense catastrophic propeller failure before it killed him, it was also Boyington. From the flight line, Lefferts watched as Aircraft 17's R-2800 engine coughed to life, sputtered once, then settled into its trademark growling snarl. Boyington ran through his pre-flight checks, magnetos, controls, propeller cycle, and Lefferts held his breath, praying the blades responded normally. Then Boyington released the brakes. The Corsair began rolling toward the runway, tail high, nose blocking the horizon, forcing him to weave side to side just to see ahead. At 8:47 a.m., Aircraft 17 lifted from Munda's coral runway and disappeared into the morning haze. Lefferts, Brinks, and Huang stood near the maintenance tent, chain-smoking cigarettes they couldn't taste, waiting to learn whether they'd made history or committed treason. The moment of truth came at 9:09 a.m., though Lefferts wouldn't hear the details until Boyington landed 52 minutes later. Boyington had climbed to 15,000 feet over the slot between New Georgia and Kolombangara, leveled out, and shoved the throttle full forward for a standard speed check, something pilots did routinely to verify airspeed instruments. He expected to see 370 mph, maybe 375 with luck. Instead, the needle shot past 380, 390, and steadied at 412 mph in level flight. His first thought, he later wrote, was that the airspeed indicator had broken. He cross-checked everything: altitude, RPM, manifold pressure, all normal. except for the fact that he was flying 40 miles per hour faster than any Corsair had ever flown at that altitude. He tried again, throttling down, then back up. Same result, 412 millimeters. He climbed slightly, dove slightly, tested at 14,000 feet, and again at 16,000. Every time, the numbers stayed the same. Something fundamental had changed, and it wasn't luck or wind. The plane felt solid, stable, and astonishingly fast. At 9:39 a.m., Boyington landed, taxied straight to the maintenance area, and cut the engine. He jumped down from the cockpit, scanning for the man responsible. Lefferts stepped forward, braced for either a promotion or a court-martial. Boyington's first words became legend. "What the hell did you do to my propeller? And can you do it to every other Corsair on this island?" Official permission never entered the conversation. By 2:00 p.m. that same day, Lefferts and his men were heating the propeller blades on aircraft 23, this time with Boyington himself standing guard, making sure no senior officers wandered over to ask questions. The second modification took only 90 minutes. Lefferts had refined his process, built sturdier measuring jigs, and even had Boyington verifying blade angles with a navigation protractor and a bit of field math ingenuity. By August 15th, 6 Corsairs in VMF 214 had been repitched. By August 18, all 18 operational aircraft in the squadron carried what the pilots now called Lefferts's bends. No one asked for authorization, and Boyington wasn't telling anyone outside his unit what his crew chief was doing to propellers after dark. The results spoke for themselves. On August 19th, 8 Corsairs from VMF 214 intercepted 15 Zeros escorting bombers toward Allied ships near Vella La Vella. It was the exact kind of engagement where Corsairs had struggled. Low altitude, high maneuvering, Japanese fighters using agility to nullify American speed that existed only on paper. Except this time, the speed was real. Lieutenant Ken Walsh scored the first kill. Diving from 16,000 feet, he pushed past his old top speed and stayed locked on a 0 through a violent reversal that would have shaken him off 2 weeks earlier. The Japanese pilot tried the classic escape dive, but Walsh's modified Corsair simply outran him. Walsh fired 250 caliber rounds into the Zero's engine, watching it spiral down in flames. The fight lasted 11 minutes. VMF 214 destroyed 7 Zeros confirmed, with 2 more probable. Not a single Corsair took serious damage. The kill ratio was 7 to none. Pilots came back exhilarated, describing something entirely new: the power to choose the fight. Captain Bill Casey's summed it up in his after-action report. "We could chase them down when they ran. We could break off when we wanted to. For the first time since I've been flying Corsairs, I felt faster than the enemy." This was what the Navy had promised when it ordered 4,000 of them, true air superiority, delivered not by engineers in Connecticut, but by a Marine crew chief with a blowtorch and a slide rule. Word spread through the Solomons like wildfire. Pilots from other squadrons began visiting Munda, asking VMF 214 airmen what kind of maintenance voodoo they were pulling. By the end of August, crew chiefs from VMF 215, VMF 221, and VMF 122 were making pilgrimages to watch Lefferts's midnight propeller ritual firsthand. To watch Lefferts work. He showed them how to do it, how to build the jigs, calculate the 2.5-degree adjustment, and heat the blades just right. The method spread quietly from squadron to squadron, almost never officially approved, but silently encouraged by maintenance officers who knew saving pilots mattered more than obeying paperwork written 8,000 miles away in Connecticut. Within 2 weeks of Boyington's test flight, about 60 Corsairs across 4 squadrons had been repitched using Lefferts's field modification. The results spoke louder than any memo. In June and July 1943, Marine Corsair squadrons in the Solomons averaged 1.3 enemy planes destroyed for every Corsair lost. In September, after the modification spread, that number exploded to 11.3 to 1. Experience, tactics, and Japan's supply problems played roles, but the speed advantage was the force multiplier. Corsairs could finally fight on their own terms. They used superior diving and level flight speed to attack when they had the edge and break away when they didn't. The Zero was still deadly in a turn fight, but those turn fights were now optional, and American pilots stopped accepting them. The shift in air tactics was revolutionary. Before the change, Corsair doctrine focused on altitude advantage and single high-speed strikes. Hit once, then climb away, because staying low meant risking death. Afterward, Corsair pilots could stay at medium altitude, fight longer, make multiple passes, and chase down crippled targets trying to flee. One pilot described it as fighting with one hand untied. Major Stan Bailey, who had given Lefferts quiet permission to do the first modification, summed it up in a classified memo to Marine Air Group 11. This field modification has fundamentally changed the tactical effectiveness of the F4U in Pacific combat operations. We are finally flying the aircraft Vought thought they built. But success has a way of attracting attention. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington discovered the unauthorized modifications in the worst possible way, through a maintenance report. A by-the-book lieutenant commander named Harold Bates visited Munda on September 8th to investigate why Corsair combat performance no longer matched factory data. Bates spent 3 days interviewing pilots, inspecting records, and eventually noticed that every VMF-214 propeller showed identical heat discoloration at the blade roots. That could only mean one thing. Someone had used torches on propellers. Someone had altered flight-critical components without authorization or engineering oversight, exposing the Navy to catastrophic risk if a blade failed in flight. Bates filed a 14-page report that landed on Admiral John McCain's desk on September 15th. 3 days later, an official board of investigation was ordered to assemble at Henderson Field to find everyone responsible and prepare court-martial charges. The team arrived September 27th. 3 officers, 2 enlisted legal clerks, and a civilian propeller engineer flown in from Hamilton Standard's Connecticut factory to inspect the modified parts. It took them only 6 hours to reach their conclusion. Every altered propeller was out of spec. The heat-treating process had likely weakened the aluminum, increasing the risk of fatigue cracks and mid-air failure. They recommended immediate grounding of all modified aircraft, replacement of every affected propeller, and court-martial of Staff Sergeant James Lefferts, along with any officers who had allowed it to happen. Major Bailey and Major Boyington were both named directly. The preliminary report accused them of criminal negligence and reckless endangerment. On September 24th, Lefferts was formally notified of charges: willful destruction of government property valued at more than $800, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and violation of technical orders under circumstances that could have resulted in pilot deaths. The possible punishment: 5 years of hard labor at Portsmouth Naval Prison, dishonorable discharge, and loss of all pay and benefits. He was confined to quarters. Brinks and Huang faced the same fate as accomplices. The maintenance tent was sealed as evidence. Every tool, torch, wrench, and measuring jig was tagged and photographed. To the Navy, it was a crime scene. But then the data arrived, and everything changed. On September 26th, Colonel Calvin Freeman, commander of Marine Air Group 11, sent a classified brief to the board. It contained kill ratios, mission summaries, and sworn statements from 43 Corsair pilots who had flown both modified and unmodified planes. The numbers were undeniable. Modified Corsair squadrons were averaging 10.7 to 1 kill ratios. Unmodified ones just 2.1 to 1, pilot after pilot testified that the extra 40 miles per hour at combat altitude had transformed their survival odds, their tactics, and the entire balance of the air war. Lieutenant Ken Walsh, who scored 11 kills in just 3 weeks flying a modified Corsair, told the board, "I'm alive because my plane was faster than the enemy. If you court-martial Sergeant Lefferts for making my plane faster, then you're court-martialing him for saving my life." His words hit harder than any technical report. The Hamilton Standard engineer complicated things even more. After inspecting 12 modified propellers using X-ray imaging, metallurgical analysis, and vibration testing, he concluded that Lefferts's field modifications were structurally sound. The heating process, while primitive, had been applied with precision. There were no microcracks, no signs of fatigue, no evidence of structural weakness. 3 propellers were slightly out of balance but still within safe limits. More tellingly, when he compared Lefferts's figures with Hamilton's own wind tunnel data, the numbers matched. His recalculations for 15,000 feet showed exactly the same performance results pilots were seeing in combat. The truth was clear. Hamilton's factory pitch was perfect for 25,000 feet. Lefferts's modification was perfect for 15,000 feet. The factory had designed for the wrong war. The court-martial never happened. On October 3, 1943, the Board of Investigation filed its final report. It recommended no disciplinary action against Lefferts, Bailey, or Boyington. The report admitted that the modifications technically violated regulations, but concluded that they had significantly improved combat effectiveness, introduced no measurable safety risk, and were performed in good faith to correct deficiencies costing pilot lives. It was the closest thing to a commendation the Navy could write without calling it one. Lefferts was released from confinement, returned to duty, and quietly instructed to stop making any more modifications until official guidance arrived. That guidance came sooner than anyone expected. On October 12, 1943, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued a classified technical bulletin to Vought Aircraft and Hamilton Standard Propeller. It admitted discreetly that its own specifications were wrong. The bulletin stated that combat in the Pacific occurred mostly between 10,000 and 16,000 feet, that the high-altitude propeller pitch was limiting performance, and that field modifications by marine maintenance personnel have demonstrated measurable improvements in aircraft capability. The Bureau ordered an immediate engineering review of all F4U propeller designs. Vought moved fast once it had the green light. By October 28, engineers at the Stratford plant had completed new wind tunnel tests on propellers repitched to 45 degrees at the effective radius. The results confirmed everything Lefferts had discovered with a slide rule and common sense. Thrust efficiency improved by 18% at 15,000 feet, engine load decreased, and acceleration at combat altitudes increased without significantly affecting high-altitude performance. On November 9, 1943, the Navy issued Technical Order F4U 127, officially changing the propeller pitch specification for all F4U-1 and F4U-1A Corsairs to 45 water at 40 inches from the hub center, exactly the same angle Lefferts had forged in the Solomon Islands months earlier. Hamilton Standard was contracted to build new propellers and retrofit the existing fleet. The conversion began in December 1943 and continued. Through February 1944, every Corsair in the Pacific either received a new propeller or had its existing one repitched using a refined process derived directly from Lefferts's technique. By March 1944, roughly 2,400 Corsairs had been upgraded or produced with what Vaught's internal documents now called combat optimized propeller pitch. The reports even credited field observations and modifications by USMC maintenance personnel in the Solomon Islands theater for identifying the issue, naming Staff Sergeant James Lefferts in 3 separate engineering memos. It was rare recognition for an enlisted man in a system that usually gave credit to officers. The results were staggering. Through 1944, Corsair kill ratios in the Pacific jumped from 11.1 to 14:1 by war's end. Experience, better tactics, and Japan's weakening forces all played roles. But speed was still the decisive factor. The Corsair could now chase down anything Japan flew, break away from losing fights, and control every engagement. By 1945, it had become the most dominant carrier-based fighter of the Pacific War, responsible for more aerial victories than any other Navy aircraft. The bent-wing bird had finally become the monster its designers had envisioned. Lefferts finished the war as a master sergeant, training propeller mechanics at Cherry Point, North Carolina. He never received a medal because the Navy didn't decorate men for breaking regulations, even when their violations saved hundreds of lives. But he earned something longer-lasting. In 1947, the Society of Automotive Engineers published a paper on field engineering in combat, using Lefferts's propeller work as a case study. In 1952, the Navy established official procedures for field performance testing, based directly on the Lefferts Protocol, outlining how crew chiefs could propose, test, and validate modifications when real combat conditions didn't match factory expectations. The modified propeller design carried through Korea, with F4U 4s and F4U 5s still using the combat-optimized pitch that traced back to a humid night in 1943 at Munda Airfield. The last Corsair retired from combat in 1969, but the principle lived on. Sometimes the people closest to the problem see the clearest solutions. That a staff sergeant with a blowtorch and a slide rule can outthink an entire engineering bureau. That regulations ensure safety, but war demands results. And somewhere between those two truths is where battles, and sometimes entire wars, are won. In August 1943, Jim Lefferts bent propeller blades. By doing so, he bent the course of the Pacific Air War, 2.5 degrees at a time.